Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Alex, and I'm the technical manager for this session, which is titled Assessing Diverse Food Environments in Low and Middle Income Countries with the Food Environment Toolbox. Our hosts today are Shauna Downs, Suparna Ghosh Jareth, Elizabeth Fox, and Air Force Lynn Ahmed and Victoria Starmajeska. Thank you so much for taking part in ANH 2024. I know we're all really excited for an informative and interactive session today. So thanks again so much for joining, everybody. I'm really excited to kick off this year's ANH Academy Week. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Shauna.
Thanks, Alex. Welcome, everyone. We're really happy to have you here today and really excited to talk about the toolbox with you. All right, so I'm just going to start with a quick overview of the Learning Lab. I'll just quickly introduce our team. You're going to have the chance to meet them all, or most of them at least, over the course of the next couple of hours. So I'll just briefly introduce them. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about food environment definitions and frameworks. We'll spend not too much time at all on this because I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but I think it will help in terms of just the framing of the toolbox itself. Then we'll go over the different tools that are included in the toolbox and provide a very brief overview of each of the tools. I apologize in advance because it will be quite brief. We have several tools in the toolbox and we want to allow enough time for the breakout sessions. So we'll be going through them fairly quickly, but we have a QR code at the end of the slide deck. So we'll present it at the end of the workshop where you can download, or you can't download, but you can view the current drafts of all of the tools. We're still in the midst of finalizing everything, but they're very close to being done. So you can peruse the different tools that are included in the toolbox there. So after we go over the tools, we'll have breakout sessions. There'll be 3 different breakout sessions. And you can self-select. So whichever tool you're more interested in understanding more about and getting some practice using, you can just join that breakout section. Then we'll come back as a group and then just do a very quick discussion and then wrap up. So this is the research team. As I mentioned, you're gonna hear from many of them today over the course of the next couple hours. So I won't introduce everyone just in the interest of time, because like I said, we have a lot to go through. In addition to our team members here included on the slide, we also have many research assistants who have assisted with this project over the course of the last couple of years, and they will be joining us also in the breakout room. So you'll see a lot of team members from both India and also from Cambodia. All right, so defining food environments. Food environments are really the consumer interface with the food system that encompasses the availability, affordability, convenience, promotion and quality, and sustainability of foods and beverages in wild, cultivated, and built spaces. And we recognize that there's many definitions of the food environment. This is the one we're using for this project, but many of the definitions, they have a lot of overlap and there's just some intricacies, but this is the one that we are using for the toolbox. We also are all aware that there's different types of food environments. And so there's 2 kind of main overarching types of food environments that we're focusing on, and the tools included in the toolbox are really designed to assess. So the natural food environment, which includes wild environments, this can be things like forests, jungles, ponds, lakes, rivers, as well as the cultivated environment, which is really the food that people are producing for their own consumption. And so that includes things like fields, kitchen gardens, aquaculture, that type of thing. And then you have the built environment. So this is where people are actually purchasing food. And this can be both within the informal built environment as well as the formal environment. So this was work that many members of our team worked on, which was very conceptual a few years ago now. And then Jess Bogart from CSIRO in Australia sort of built out this framework to think about other types of food environments, including kin and community, which is really the social networks and the trading and exchange of food amongst community members, as well as food aid and services or supplemental food assistance, which we've also included as food environment types within the food environment toolbox framing. And then you have the domains of the food environment. So many of you will be aware of the external and personal domains and that type of framing. So the external food environment is really the objective food environment. And then the personal food environment is really related to people's perceptions of the food environment, as well as their lived experience interacting with the food environments that they have access to. So that then feeds into these dimensions of the food environment, which these are the dimensions of the external food environment, and they include the promotion of food, so which foods are promoted within the environment, the affordability of foods, their availability, the convenience of foods in terms of the time cost of obtaining, preparing, and consuming foods, the quality, which includes safety as part of that, as well as sustainability properties. And while sustainability properties aren't always included in the dimensions of the food environment, we think it's pretty important to include this, particularly as we start to think about interventions within the food environment to address issues around sustainability, for example, things like plastics. All right, so first poll is, so we're going to do several polls throughout the plenary or the kind of main session. So this is the first of the polls. So which of the dimensions of the external food environment do you find the most relevant to measure in your own work? So it's looking like at least the first glimpses that availability and affordability are pretty important. Definitely looks like those are the two that are most relevant, or people think are most relevant to measure within the environments. So there's many tools in the toolbox that assess the availability of food. And then we also have a tool that's designed to measure the affordability of food as well. So why is measuring the food environment important? I think that since you're at this workshop, you probably have a sense that it's important to measure the food environment. One of the main reasons is really because poor quality diets are among the top contributors of the global burden of disease. So it is really important to measure food environments because they're very much driving people's diets. And this is really part of this dietary and nutrition transition that we often see in low and middle income countries in particular. And then understanding the dimensions of the food environment that are influencing food choice can really help to inform the design of interventions and programs that are aimed at improving diet quality as well as nutrition outcomes. So for that reason, it's also really important to measure the food environment. So in terms of measuring food environments in low and middle income countries, it's, I think, very important to measure the different types of food environments, because people aren't just accessing food from the built environment, which is, you know, the situation a lot of times in high income countries, but in low and middle income countries, often a lot of the food that people are consuming come from the wild as well as the cultivated environment. So it's really important to measure those different types of food environments. One of the challenges, though, in terms of measuring food environments in low middle income countries is that they're very dynamic. So trying to capture that dynamism is really difficult. And so we've really thought a lot about that in terms of the tools that we have developed as part of this toolbox. And really trying to understand how we can best capture that dynamic nature of the food environments in low and middle income countries. And then lastly, you really need to capture a range of different food environment dimensions. So availability and affordability were the dimensions that you all thought were the most relevant, and I completely agree with that, and I think they are. It's also important to capture these other dimensions like promotion, quality, and sustainability properties as well. So the toolbox is, again, very much designed to capture all of those different dimensions of the food environment across the different tools. So the next poll, these are just a list of some of the existing tools as well as tools that we've included in the toolbox. So we just want to understand which tools people have used in their own work in the past. All right, so my first glimpses seem to show that people are using various different tools. So there isn't a strong, clear winner in terms of the tools that people are using to assess the food environment at the moment. But definitely quite a large variety are being used, which is great. Okay, All right, so now we'll shift gears and just talk very briefly about the toolbox overall, and then we'll get into discussing or providing an overview of the different tools themselves. So this toolbox has been developed as part of an Amana-funded grant. It's called the Food Environment Toolbox, Tools to Measure Natural and Built Environments in Low Middle Income Countries. We started the project just over 2 years ago now, and it has been a very iterative process of developing this toolbox. There are 4 main objectives of this grant. So the first is to develop a perception-based or personal food environment survey instrument for low and middle income countries. The second is to modify existing objective food environment tools for low and middle income countries. And in that case, we looked at what tools already existed and then tried to modify those based on our own experience in the field, but then also through various piloting exercises, and also just, you know, as a team going over the different tools. Then we have the third objective is to pilot, test, and refine the food environment tools, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then to develop food environment toolbox protocols for each of the tools to make it easy for people to pick up the tools and use them as part of their own work, because we really want to make them available to everyone. So as part of these 4 objectives, we did quite a few different exercises to get to the point that we are in terms of the toolbox. So we did a Delphi survey, we did workshops with experts, cognitive testing, and pilot testing in both India and Cambodia. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here. So in terms of the first objective, which was to develop the Food Environment Perception Survey, we were calling it the Food Environment Perception Survey, or FEPS. We started with identifying existing survey items in the literature, and then we did Delphi surveys to prioritize survey items. And so some of you in this room might have been involved in that Delphi survey. We then did cognitive testing in both India and in Cambodia. When we first did the cognitive testing in India, we found that the first section of the survey took an hour and a half, which obviously is not feasible. And so we had to cull a lot of questions, and we've made a lot of changes to the survey over the course of the last year or so. We then did workshops with food environment experts in both India and Cambodia, made additional changes, and then we pilot tested it in rural, urban, and peri-urban settings in each of the countries. So this has been incredibly iterative. I think I'll continue to mention that over the course of this workshop, but it really, really has, and we're still making changes based on our piloting experiences. So it's definitely been a lot of work, and probably more than we anticipated. But I think in the end, the tools are quite good, and I think that you all will find them useful. In terms of the external food environment assessments, we again started with the literature. So we reviewed existing tools, then we refined them based on our team's experience. So we have a lot of expertise and also experience of doing field work in related to food environments in low and middle income country settings. So we really pulled on that to make initial changes. We did workshops with experts and made a lot of changes based on the feedback that we received. And then again, very iterative process of refining the tools, piloting, then refining them a bit more, then piloting again, and then refining them more and piloting them again. So it's definitely been iterative. This slide just gives you an overview of all of the different tools included in the toolbox and the different food environment types that they are addressing, as well as the food environment dimensions. And on the left-hand side, you have the domains, so the perceived and objective food environment. So what you can hopefully take away from this slide is that for the most part, tools aren't going to capture all of the different dimensions or types of food environment in one tool, but with the combination of different tools, you can address the different dimensions in the food environment, as well as the different domains and food environment types. So the idea is that whatever the objectives of your own research are, you can pick up the tools that will address those dimensions that are important to capture. So if it's availability and affordability, you might be using the community food environment mapping tool as an example, and the cost of a healthy diet data collection protocol. So the tools included in the toolbox use food groups, and we have the same food groups that are used in all of the tools. This has been incredibly challenging, and so we are still not at a consensus in terms of the food groups we'll be using in the toolbox. The food groups that I've included here are not the finalized food groups. Again, this has been very iterative. We've probably had, I don't even know, 20 versions of food groups at least that we've been using as part of the tools, but then making changes based on piloting, based on what enumerators understand and don't understand. Because, you know, at one point we had a lot more of the NOVA classifications in terms of ultra processed foods, and that became pretty challenging for enumerators. So we made a lot of changes, and we're continuing to make tweaks. And I will just say it's very challenging to come up with food groups that really are capturing the key drivers of poor quality diets in the food environment, and work with all the tools and relate to different types of food environments, the wild, cultivated, and built, and work across all of the tools. So this is definitely a work in progress, and we're more than happy to get feedback from people in terms of what they think is really important to capture in terms of food groups. All right, so at this point, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Dr. Supana Ghosh-Jareth, who's at the George Institute for Global Health in India, and she's going to talk about the first few tools included in the toolbox.
Thank you, Shauna. Hello, everyone. And I'm here to support Shauna and the team in explaining some of the tools that have been developed as a part of this effort. And the first three tools that I'm going to discuss are the participatory mapping tool, the seasonal calendar, and the food environment perception survey. So participatory mapping, I'm sure all of you have done some kind of a participatory mapping in your respective research areas, wherein it is like a starting point to map the community. So it is a participatory effort wherein we try to answer some of the research questions like, what are the different types of food environments that the communities have access to, where and how they acquire different types of foods, and how does the food access change across time and season. Now, as I said, this is a good starting point to use the Food Environment Toolbox per se. If we go to the previous slide, Shauna, please. Why are we looking at different types of food access? Because first we want to know what all we want to map and have an overarching view of the kind of food environment people are accessing to. Now, this could be a built food environment or a natural food environment in terms of the food they are cultivating or they are collecting from the forest or jungles, or a built food environment, and there are further classifications to that as well. This gives an overarching view where the community sits with the researcher and maps the food environment by making a rough diagram or a rough illustrative map of their food environment and where they go to access food. It could be something within the community or a market at a distant place or a food security program from the government. That also comes from an outlet or a vehicle that comes to their community to give food or to sell food. Next slide. So the objective of this particular tool is to assess the type of food environment that the community has access to and guide us in selecting the tools from the FET toolbox. Us means the researcher, the enumerator. This sort of informs them how to go about using the Food Environment Toolbox. What does it assess the food environment in terms of the perceived food environment? That is, the domain here is what people perceive as their food environment, as well as capturing information about the different food environment types. The dimensions of food environment included using this particular tool is to assess the availability, the promotion, the convenience, as well as sustainability. How is it administered? It is administered through a focus group discussion facilitator. This could be a nutrition researcher or an enumerator who is trained well for administering this particular tool. The target group, of course, are the people who are from the community but know about where all do they go and access food from. They could be primary shoppers, the people who are producing their own food, and other people who know where all the food is coming from at the household level. The method and the time taken is around 1 to 1.5 hours, but it gives a good overview of what all different food environment domains and not domains, food environment types that we need to study. The FGD is conducted, and drawing out a map of the community food environment is the outcome of this tool. Next slide. So for the participatory mapping tool, as I said, we are mapping the community food environment, all types of food environment types accessed. The availability domain looks at food access from different food environment types, types of promotion that are happening within the community. So if there is a hoarding in the community, they can just put that this is where people are getting a lot of information from, or a wall writing, which is very prominent in the community. The convenience, that is, how do they access the different food environment types, whether they are taking a vehicle, they are walking down to that point, how much of time is taken to go and access food from the jungle, for example. And of course, sustainability in terms of seasonal variation in the food access. Next slide. So what is the output of the tool? It gives information about the food access points, as I've already mentioned. This can help inform sampling of the food environment. So for the community mapping, you will come to know from this particular map that yes, within the community, there are access points. There is a market which is 5 kilometers from the community where people are getting their day-to-day food items. Information related to the convenience of accessing the food environment points, and information related to the food and beverage promotion that exists within that particular community. So we will have a breakout session on participatory mapping, and those who are interested in this can actually join that breakout session and have some hands-on activities happening there. Next slide. The next one is a seasonal food availability calendar, and this is a very traditional tool which has been used for a long time by the food systems researchers, especially in low middle income countries where people do not relate things mostly with specific dates, but with different seasons. And seasonal availability is an important factor related to the access of different foods and the diversity that exists in different seasons. Next slide. So what research question does this tool answer? How does the food availability vary across seasons, across the year? What are the main sources of different foods in different seasons? And what have been the changes in the food availability over time? This is critical because there are lean seasons, there are seasons of plenty, and where the diversity also changes proportionately depending on the seasons of availability of different foods from different access points. So this is a traditional tool which can be of a great value addition to our food environment toolbox. Next slide. So what is the objective? To assess the seasonal availability of foods and any perceived changes to their availability due to climate variability and other changes. So it gives some kind of a historical data also, which is very critical to answer some of the research questions that we may have as food environment researchers. The food environment that it is assessing is the external environment, including the wild, cultivated, and built food environment. It talks about the dimensions like availability and sustainability, and it is administered through a focus group discussion by a facilitator who could be an enumerator or a food systems researcher. And the target population are again people who are familiar with their market, wild, and cultivated food environment in the community. The method is FGD, and it takes a lot of time if you have a diverse food environment being accessed by the community. Next slide. It's a kind of a repetition where we can see that all food environment types can be assessed using this particular tool. But first, we have to start with a free listing of the fresh and minimally processed food that are available in the community and have a seasonality component. The sustainability part, on the other hand, relates to the changes in the food availability over the past 10 years. So our focus group discussion guide provides all the instructions and all the questions which are critical to be put across during the FGD group discussion that happens for administering this tool. Next slide. So this is how the food availability calendar looks like. It can be in the form of a heat map kind of a thing, or an availability tool. Or an availability tool where we have tick marks, wherein the number of ticks, the more availability of that particular food in that period of time. Sometimes relating to events and festivals and other things along with the months is very critical in administering this particular tool. Next slide. So what can I do with this data? The information from this assessment can be used in a variety of ways to develop interventions that can improve the diet quality in terms of making foods which are seasonally available as part of the supplementary feeding programs or nutrition education material for the community, where the community can connect better with those foods. Also, seasonal calendars can be used as a starting point for homegrown school feeding programs or garden preparations, as nutrition gardens are an important intervention in several of the communities in traditional societies. Next slide. And the last tool that I'm going to explain is again a perception-based tool where we are trying to capture individual perception about the food environment, which is called the Food Environment Perception Survey. It's a survey. Next slide. It's a survey and it tries to address research questions which are related to where are people accessing their food from, why are they accessing those foods from there, and which foods are being accessed from different food environment types. How do people perceive the different dimensions of their food environment, like food availability, affordability, convenience, quality, promotion, and sustainability? And how does the different dimension of the food environment influence food acquisition amongst the community? Next slide. So the objective, as I said, to assess people's perception of their food environment. The food environment domain is the perceived or the personal food environment, and it includes the types like wild, cultivated, built environment. Then the dimensions of the food environment include the 6 dimensions like accessibility, affordability, convenience, quality, promotion, and sustainability. And it is administered by a field investigator. And I would like to reiterate here that we need to have a field investigator to administer the tool rather than a self-administered tool, because there are different terminologies and understanding of categorizing the food items being consumed and the different food environments that are being accessed by people. If you make it self-administered, there is a lot of priming which is required, which may introduce a bias in the data that we capture through this tool, but a detailed training of the enumerator is very critical for this particular tool. The sampling is based on the study population, and the method of administration could be a paper-based or a tablet or a digitally administered tool, and the time taken is around 45 minutes. Next slide. So the food environment perception-based tool, the types and dimensions assessed, as I said, assesses all food environment types. It talks about availability, like where are they getting their foods from? Are they happy with the availability of the food? Affordability, which foods are considered expensive? Which food they would have consumed if the prices were cheaper? Or which are the food which are consumed because they are cheaper and readily available. The quality of food in terms of their cleanliness, presence of pesticides and chemicals, and food adulteration. Promotion, that is, are they getting information on, is nutrition literacy promoted in the community? Are they looking at food from the promotion perspective, like people are making certain foods thought to be valuable or promoted as part of the various promotional strategies? Are people reading the labels of the food? Convenience, time and mode to access different food access points, and the time taken in food preparation and other convenience aspects of food that are being chosen at the household level. And finally, there is an optional section on sustainability, which talks about the changes experienced in accessing natural food environment, the role of climate change, environmental change, and others. And also the food sovereignty aspect is also assessed in some of the optional questions. Next slide. So the content, as you can see, and we are going to have a breakout session where we are going to see the number of questions that are being dedicated to each dimension of the food environment. Next slide. And what is the output? The data will help us identify the different food access points, which types of foods are acquired from where, and identify perceptions related to availability, affordability, convenience, quality, sustainability, and how these factors influence food choices in the community. Next slide. I'll finish here and over to Shauna to discuss the community food environment mapping. Thank you.
Thanks, Suparna. So I'm going to talk about the community food environment mapping. This will also be one of the tools, or a set of tools, actually, I should say, that will be covered in one of the breakout sessions. We'll actually cover the community, the market, and then the in-depth vendor assessment as well. All right, so which research questions does the community food environment mapping tools answer? So the first is, which types of food outlets and mobile vendors do consumers have access to in their communities? And then what types of foods are sold and promoted within their community? The community food environment mapping includes actually 3 different tools, and it will depend on the study context in terms of, or the study setting in terms of which tools you actually use for your work. So the objective is really to assess the types of food outlets and mobile vendors, if it's a community that relies on mobile vendors, that consumers have access to, and the quality of foods sold and promoted within them. It assesses the external built environment, the dimensions it includes or assesses are availability, promotion, and quality to a certain extent. It is administered by a field investigator, so the enumerator would have a tablet, and it's an observational checklist. In terms of the sampling, the community food environment mapping is meant to be done as a census. So you're looking at all of the food outlets within the given community. And the way you define the community will very much vary on your research. In some cases, for example, in Cambodia, we define the community as a commune. In other settings, it might be a village, or a series of a few villages in your proximity to one another. It really depends on the study setting. So in the community, however it is that you define that, you would be assessing all of the different food outlets. In terms of the amount of time this takes, it really depends on the density of outlets and how big the community is. I will say in Cambodia, when we were doing it at the commune level, it never took more than 1 day to collect these data. So what do you get from the community food environment mapping? You get a sense of the food outlets in the community. So you're measuring the food outlets, and I'll go over the vendor types and food outlet types in the breakout session if you join that session. So you have more background information in terms of how we've actually set up the tool. We also capture the GPS coordinates of those food outlets, the level of permanence, what food groups are sold at each vendor, and then the form of the foods. So are they mostly raw or fresh, or are they mostly deep fried, that type of thing. And then we have observations about whether or not the foods sold are damaged, spoiled, or have insects on them. And then lastly, we capture promotion. So which food groups are being promoted, what is the type of promotion, how is it promoted, how visible is the promotion, because we know in low and middle income countries that often you'll have umbrellas, as an example, that are branded, but they have been used for many, many years, and you can't actually quite make out the promotion. So that shouldn't, when we're trying to look at exposure to food promotions, that shouldn't really be counted in the same way as something that's brand new and that you can really see what is actually being promoted. And then lastly, we also ask about whether or not the promotions are targeting children. So these are the 3 components or 3 tools that are included in the community food environment mapping tools. So the first is the food outlet census, which I just described. Then we have the roadside food and beverage promotion tool, as well as the third mobile vendor census tool. And so, like I said, it will really depend on your study setting in terms of which tools you use. In India, we did not really use the roadside food and beverage promotion tool in the rural areas because there just wasn't any roadside promotions. But in Cambodia, it's quite different. You have a ton of roadside food promotions. I should say beverage promotions, because it's mostly beer ads and also energy drinks. But you see quite a few. So it's really important to use that tool in that setting. And then also the mobile vendor census, again, it really depends on the community. So in Cambodia, we really found from the participatory mapping tool that Supanna already described, that in some of the communities, people really had shifted away from accessing food from markets. So in some cases, there wasn't even a market that they were accessing food from. So instead, they were accessing a lot of food from mobile vendors. And so what we realized is that if we're not capturing those mobile vendors, then we're missing a really important component of the food environment, because people tend to get not only the unhealthy foods from the mobile vendors, but a lot of the fresh foods, fresh fruits and vegetables, fish, meat, that type of thing. So that's why we included this tool in the toolbox as well, or in this set of tools that are in the community food environment mapping. I'm going to skip over these next few slides because I've kind of described them, and just in the interest of time. But in terms of the outputs that you get from all three of these tools, you get you can spatially map the food vendors or the promotion types that are included in the community food environment, and this can provide insight into gaps in terms of the food availability, as well as the abundance of unhealthy foods. You can use you could calculate the market or community food diversity index, and describe the quality of food sold at food outlets as well. I will say, in terms of the data analysis component of the toolbox, this is something that we're really beginning to focus our attention on now. As we've started to refine the tools to the point that they're almost finalized, we are now thinking through the data analysis. And Supana and I were doing a workshop at the World Public Health Nutrition Conference last week. And there's a lot of discussion in terms of like the metrics, or like, is there going to be a dashboard, or what are the indicators that will come out of the toolbox? And that's definitely something that we're working towards, and is a work in progress. And I think we have a lot of thinking to do in terms of how best to do that as well. So the roadside, as I mentioned, so this is just an example of a roadside promotion for an energy drink in Cambodia. And let me just skip. So this is an example for the mobile vendor tool that's done as part of the toolbox and the community mapping. You have an enumerator that sits or stands at a certain point in the community, a thoroughfare or some area where the mobile vendors are coming in. And then they observe the mobile vendors and what they're selling, what they're promoting from that standpoint. This can be really difficult. Sometimes it depends on the type of community. In some cases, it's pretty easy to flag the mobile vendors and do the observational checklist. In other cases, it's not so much. So this is also something that we've piloted, and we're trying to provide really great and thorough instructions to make it easier for people to adopt this tool. But again, you won't need to use this in all contexts. It's really just when mobile vendors are a really prominent component of the food environment. So the market mapping tool should be used, again, only if people are really accessing markets within the food environment that you're studying. So the participatory mapping can really help to identify this and whether or not you really need to use the market mapping tool or not. So the market mapping tool answers what are the market properties and infrastructure, which types of food vendors do consumers have access to in the market, and what types of foods are sold and promoted. So it's the same types of questions that are answered through the community mapping, but this is then at the market level. Again, this is administered by a field investigator. In terms of the sampling within the market, it really depends on the market. So if it's a smaller market, you might do a census of all the vendors included in the market. However, if it's a larger market, you likely want to do a subsample, and we provide instructions for how to do that, and an additional kind of layer or module of the tool to help guide the sampling of that as well. And so we sort of initially had thought just to do a census of all the vendors in the markets. And then more recently, when I was in Cambodia doing the piloting in an urban in Phnom Penh, when it was very hot, it was right before the rain started, and it was incredibly hot, in like 44 degrees Celsius or something like that. And my colleague, Nadav, who is not on this call today, unfortunately, he was piloting the tool in one of the markets. And he said that he almost passed out because he was so hot and there's too much heat stress. And he was like, we cannot ask enumerators to do this. So we had to sort of rethink our approach and try and make sure that we're able to collect the data that we want, but in a way that also makes the most sense and is the most efficient. So the types of questions we have, so we have questions related to the vendor types, the foods they're sold, the form they're sold, much like the community mapping. And then in terms of the quality, we have questions related to water access, electricity, waste management, that type of thing. We have questions related to the number of days that the markets are open, the hours of operation, road access, and then promotion. So the same promotion module that we have in the community food environment mapping. So in terms of the outputs that you get from the market mapping tool, so you have a sense of the food vendor types in the market, as well as the foods they sell and promote. You can describe the quality of food sold, as well as calculate the market food diversity index. So this, again, is very similar in terms of the outputs that you get as the community food environment mapping tools. So now I will pass it to Vicky, who's going to talk about the in-depth vendor assessment.
Hi, everyone. The in-depth vendor assessment has been developed as an observational checklist to assess the properties of food sold by vendors as well as the vendors themselves. So, which research questions does the in-depth vendor assessment answer? The in-depth vendor assessment is used to elicit information on what foods a vendor is selling, the sustainability and labeling properties of those foods, how those foods are being sold, stored, the vendor's hygiene, and what food and beverage promotions are present at the vendor. Next slide. The overall objective of the in-depth vendor assessment is to assess several food environment dimensions in a subsample of vendors and food outlets in the markets and communities as part of the external built food environment. The observational checklist covers the availability, promotion, quality, and sustainability dimensions of the food environment and is administered in the field by an enumerator to a subsample of different types of vendors. Next slide. As I just mentioned, the different dimensions of the food environment that are being assessed are the availability, quality, promotion, and sustainability. To measure availability, the enumerator will capture information on the level of permanence of a food vendor, such as if they operate out of a permanent stall or if they're mobile, what food groups and specific foods are being sold, and what forms those foods are being sold in. The quality of foods being sold will be determined through objective observation, such as how they're sold, the vendor's hygiene, and if the foods are damaged or spoiled, as well as if the vendor has access to water and what the quality of that water looks like. The promotion of foods and beverages being sold is going to use the same promotion module that's being used in the community food environment tools. And the aspects of sustainability that we're interested in capturing are related to any sustainability related promotions, as well as the vendor's use of plastics. Next slide, please. The data collected using this tool allows researchers to quickly characterize the diversity of foods being sold by a vendor, as well as various properties about the vendor itself. I'll pass it on to Anna Hareforth right now to discuss the cost of a healthy diet protocol that's going to be included in the toolbox.
Thanks, Vicki. And thanks everyone for your attendance today and your attention. As Shauna mentioned in the beginning, there are a lot of tools that we're going through. And so you're hearing an introduction to a lot of them. We will get to practice some of them, not this one today, because actually there's another whole learning lab on this topic on Wednesday. But I'll go through what we have added to the cost of a healthy diet protocol that's used globally and in countries, what we've added to be able to use it locally for food environment assessment in this toolbox. So if you go to the next slide, the main research question that the cost of healthy diet tool will help answer is essentially, it's in the name, what is the cost of a healthy diet? And that means how much does it cost to obtain a diet that satisfies food-based dietary guidelines? So kind of a very agreed minimum standard of what a healthy diet is. Often food-based dietary guidelines are used to in behavior change communication to encourage people to consume diets that meet dietary guidelines. And we want to understand, does their food environment allow that? Is it really a matter of their personal choice to be able to select a diet that meets dietary guidelines, or is their choice constrained by their food environment, specifically the affordability of that diet in the market? Next slide. So the food environment that we're assessing using this tool is the market. It's the external built food environment. So sometimes when we look at the cost of a healthy diet in the market and the cost is high, we can then think about other areas of the food environment that may be able to help people access healthy diets beyond the market, if they have access to wild areas, if they have access to their own cultivation, or sometimes to food aid, if that would help them to afford a healthy diet if the cost is high in the external built food environment. And we're looking here at the affordability of the healthy foods that make up a healthy diet. The protocol that we have here for collecting food price data can also be used to collect the prices of unhealthy foods or foods to be limited or avoided, in order to do some research comparisons of, what are the price incentives for people to possibly choose less healthy kinds of foods instead of the kinds of foods that are recommended. But the basic tool is looking at the scope of healthy foods that make up a healthy diet. And so this is a tool that would be administered by an investigator in the field and going to vendors who are selling the necessary foods to be assessed in markets. And the food price data collection can be administered either digitally on a tablet or on paper. And the time depends on how in-depth the data collection is. So in the next slide, what we're looking at again mainly is the food price data for food groups that are recommended in dietary guidelines for places where there aren't specific national dietary guidelines that can be referred to. We can look at the Healthy Diet Basket, which is the global set of it's like an amalgamation of dietary guidelines around the world, arriving at the most common food groups that are recommended across countries, and it's what's used for global monitoring of this indicator by FAO and the World Bank. And so it has the Healthy Diet Basket has 6 different food groups, and we can collect food price data for these food groups, as well as for discretionary foods that might not be necessary for a healthy diet, but might be competing with people's expenditures when they are trying to purchase healthy diets in the market. So we're mainly, if you go back to the last slide, I just wanted to mention that we're mainly looking at affordability here, but we can also use this tool to bring in the aspects of quality, convenience, and sustainability, because it is possible to look at the prices of food options that have varying quality or varying convenience or varying sustainability. For example, you could look at convenience in terms of a food item that is prepared and ready to eat versus a food item that would take, it would require someone to spend time to cook and prepare that item. And you would expect to see a cost difference for that convenience premium. So similarly, if we look at sustainability, you could look at differences between organic or conventional produce, for example, and see what is the premium for supposedly higher sustainability. I think if you go to the next, yeah, thanks. So in the food price data collection protocol for this toolbox, we have instructions for identifying a list of foods where you can collect prices. And this is in addition to what the cost of healthy diet protocol globally has been when we talk about cost of healthy diet in the food prices for nutrition program, we have been using prices that are already collected by governments in order to use this indicator as a monitoring indicator. And we recognize that when we're trying to assess food environments locally, we might not be able to depend on prices collected by governments. So we might need to collect our own food prices in local areas based on some of the tools you already heard about, the mapping tools and the vendor assessment. We might actually need to collect prices in very localized environments that people are accessing. And so this protocol has provided some instructions for researchers to actually collect prices themselves where they cannot really depend on secondary price data for this indicator. So we have instructions for which foods to focus on, how to replicate price observations to get prices that are credible and realistic, the timing of price data collection, instructions for how to deal with prices that aren't listed, discounts, variations in quality, as I mentioned, different convenience and sustainability properties. And it seems like it's an easy thing to collect food prices, but the devil's in the detail, and we've sort of identified a bunch of different things that come up when you go into a market and you try to get prices that really reflect what consumers are facing when they go to buy foods. And so again, we also have instructions for collecting food price data for other foods that are not necessarily recommended, but are competing with healthier options. So if we go, I guess, back to the slide, I wanted to point out that this we call it a toolkit for food prices for nutrition. It's a protocol that has already existed. It's on the Food Prices for Nutrition website for entering the food price data once it's collected, and then using that data to automatically calculate the cost of a healthy diet. So we're sort of putting these two tools together for this Food Environment Toolbox, the protocol for price data collection, and then latching on to the Food Prices for Nutrition toolkit to actually use that price data that's been collected in order to produce the cost of healthy diet indicator. And what you will get once you enter in all of those food prices that you've collected from the market and you put them into that toolkit that is on the Food Prices for Nutrition site to crunch the numbers, you'll come out with this kind of output where you have the cost of each of 6 food groups that are shown here. So we have starchy staples, legumes, nuts, and seeds, animal source foods, fruits, vegetables, and fats and oils. And so we'll come out with what are the least cost items in each of those food groups and add up the cost of the least cost items in each of those 6 food groups to come up with the total cost of a healthy diet in that market or in that location. So I think that's the last of the introduction here. If you want to know more in detail about that calculation and also how to calculate affordability, there's a whole nother learning lab that you can come to on Wednesday where we will go in depth into this tool. So it's not one of the ones we'll use in the breakout groups today because there's this opportunity later in the week. But that was a quick overview for how it can be used within the context of the whole toolbox. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Selena Ahmed to talk about the pro-desirability tool.
Greetings, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Great to hear about these different food environment tools and how they've been used in the piloting in India and Cambodia. It's also wonderful to see so many researchers from around the world. I enjoyed reading your intros in the chat. I'm briefly going to speak about produce desirability tool. I developed this tool with some researchers in Montana in a rural community, really based on looking at tremendous variation in the sensory attributes of food. And so this tool was developed as a rapid field survey to assess food quality based on the sensory attributes of food. There's emerging research on how important food quality is in terms of determining food choice. And so we were noticing that just because something was available in the food environment, it wasn't always being selected. We carried out the Nutrition Environment Measurement Survey, or NEMS, which was developed for a US context, and noticed that there was significant difference in food quality based on the parameter of a 0 and 1 in terms of looking at produce between more rural and more urban contexts. And so we really wanted to build this up with a more deep dive in a sensory analysis to understand the different attributes, sensory attributes of food, including the visual appeal, the touch, the aroma, the size of the food. And so we pilot tested this in a US context in a rural community, as well as urban communities, and used food science evaluation. Food science evaluation usually has two ways of evaluating food. The first one is using a trained panel for a more objective evaluation of food. And then the second one is a more subjective evaluation where you ask consumers to analyze the food. And so we wanted to look at the external food environment. And so we had trained enumerators who were mostly students be trained on the different desirability attributes, and then go out into the field and evaluate a set of most commonly consumed fruits and vegetables. We found that there was really high inter-rater reliability among raters of the different produce despite their preferences. So for example, if someone did not like a tomato, they still were able to follow the food quality parameters and rate a tomato with high desirability. And we have now pilot tested this in multiple contexts, including via the USAID's Advancing Nutrition Project. Shauna was also involved with this. We pilot tested it in Liberia, Timor-Leste, and Honduras. And I think what we found is that there's tremendous variability between the raters in the different contexts. And it really speaks to the importance of context specificity in adapting food environment tools, I think, to different contexts. And so I'm going to look at the next slide. Anything else I want to say? Yeah, I think because we found so much variability and we tested this as an objective parameter of the food environment, I would recommend for future research, because I do find food quality and the visual appeal and the sensory appeal of food so important, that in the future that we could look at this tool more from a consumer perspective. So really more of a subjective tool where we have consumers in the food environment evaluate the foods. And I think this will really help us understand if there's certain attributes of foods that define specific cultural groups. I will pass it over to Shauna to speak a little bit more about how the results from pilot testing this in communities in India and in Cambodia.
Thanks, Lena. So we piloted tested pro-desirability in rural, peri-urban, and urban settings in both Cambodia and India, which is how we pilot tested all of the tools included in the toolbox. And we found that it was very difficult to implement. And so we started to get creative and to try different ways of using pro-desirability in India in particular. So we started by trying to use focus group discussion. So as part of the participatory mapping tool, we use the focus group to identify the criteria for measuring the different sensory properties of the different foods, which took a lot of time, but also there was not very much consensus among participants in the focus group. So then we tried another way of doing this. So we bought fruit from the market and brought it to a focus group and tried to get them to use the pro-desirability tool. And again, there was really not much consensus. So just to give you an example, this is an example from Cambodia, but in some cases, people actually want to see insects on their fruits and vegetables and animal source foods, because that means that that's an indicator to them that there aren't pesticides being used, whereas other people don't want to see insects. So then when you're trying to come up with criteria that can be used consistently by enumerators across different settings, it becomes really tricky. And so it just led us to think that maybe we need to take a different approach in terms of assessing these sensory properties because of this lack of consensus. So what we have been thinking about is potentially doing consumer surveys rather than trying to rely on an enumerator to be doing this kind of qualitative assessment of the quality of different fresh foods. So that's kind of where we've landed in terms of the pro-desirability tool.
So in the breakout session, we'll have about 45 minutes for you to learn about in more depth one of the tools. In each breakout session, we'll review the tool, give you some time to practice exploring the tool, and then we will have a brief discussion on what value addition you see with this tool, what challenges you might anticipate and how you might overcome those challenges, and then how you could anticipate using the tool in your own work, if at all.
So basically, when you capture the data, so one of the things I didn't mention in the main room was that as part of the toolbox, you'll have the tools, the paper-based version of the tools, the instructions, as well as the programming file, so that you're able to use the tools with tablets as part of your own work. So this will hopefully make it easy for people to take up these tools as part of their own research with minimal effort in terms of programming, because we know that often delays projects and takes a long time. And so Vicky, who is one of our team members, has really done a great job of creating these Kobo humanitarian files for all of the tools, which can be used and can be tweaked based on a programming module that she created. So if you want to use different food groups, or if you're only interested in certain food environment types, you can indicate that, and then the tool will populate based on what your needs are. So you can also use if you use ODK or CS Pro or whatever platform you use to capture data, it will be very simple to be able to use our programming file too, because you'll have the Excel file, so you can upload it and make the tweaks that are necessary for whatever platform you're using. So this is looking at data from the Food Environment Perception Survey. This is just kind of the quick and dirty data that you get. So you can just do some quick quality checks in the field. So if, when you're going to actually do the data analysis, you would do more sophisticated analyses, but this just gives you a sense of what it looks like. So we added a question for this workshop to see, so you could select which section of the survey that you wanted to work on, so that people were able to look at the questions that they were most interested in. So you can see the accessibility section was the one that the majority of people selected. So this is looking at, say, over the past 30 days, where did you procure your food from? So you can see built spaces were predominant, but people were also accessing their food from cultivated, in communities. So again, that's the exchange or trading of food, supplemental food assistance, as well as the wild food environment. And then this is just in more detail in terms of the different outlet types that people were accessing. So you can see the formal supermarkets were pretty important. So were small groceries or kiosks, as well as mobile vendors, which we're realizing is very important in many settings. Maybe I'll just show. Subhana, is there anything in particular you want me to show?
No, this is all right. I just wanted to provide them with a glimpse of it, and thank you so much for sharing it. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to give you, so this is, then you get information about, for example, which foods or food groups are being accessed from the mobile vendors. So you can see that legumes, pulses, nuts, starchy staples, eggs, all being accessed by mobile vendors. So I will also show quickly, because I didn't get a chance in my group, what the food outlet census looks like. So again, you'll get a sense of the food outlet type, more specifically what type, and then also information about the food groups that are being sold by the vendors. And then you also get information about the promotion that you're being exposed to at that vendor. So hopefully that gives you just a very quick sense of what the data looks like. But again, this is the very quick and dirty version of it. You would need to do some data analysis that's more sophisticated, and that is something that we're working on developing is the data analysis protocols as well. So I think at this point, I will switch back to the slides, and then Elizabeth will guide the discussion.
Right, so these are the prompts, which I don't think any of us really were able to get. But based off of the little you learned about the tool in the breakout session, what value addition do you see using this tool that you might not have known about or thought about prior to the session that you just had? And you can put it in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute and share their observations from participating. Yeah, so I think a lot of these tools are really great. I think having a systematic way to measure things allows you to look at changes over time across different settings. So we hope that it could be applicable to settings, including those that aren't necessarily stable or constants. Yeah, and the focus on different types of foods. What do you see as some of the challenges of implementing this tool, and how might you overcome those challenges? I think the piloting teams have been really thoughtful to making sure that the tools can be implemented in a way that is actually feasible and with materials that are readily accessible. So we hope that that makes it easier to actually apply them.
I could respond to this if it's okay. So I guess my question is really, a lot of these tools seem very like they're disentangling a very complex environment, and they're very descriptive. And I think that and it can really highlight differences and different patterns, and even I can see using this for change over time. But I guess I kind of wondered what approaches have been used beyond that sort of descriptive environment, looking at not just mapping, but saying, okay, what are the drivers or mechanisms that are shifting this, and how have you all negotiated sort of the trade-offs between different communities' access points, or there must be a lot of disparities that are highlighted through using these tools. And I guess getting further down the road towards some more explanatory applications of this, I just wondered where you think the most promise lies.
Yeah, I don't know, Shauna or Suparna, if you have any immediate thoughts related to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my immediate thought is that it's true that the tools are descriptive. The idea is really to be able to describe the environments better so that we can then identify how to intervene. In terms of the drivers of the food environment itself, that's not something that we're capturing. I think we've had discussions, and even in in some of the workshops, we talked as a group about including, like looking more upstream in the supply chain too, and capturing data about where the vendors are purchasing their food from, or that type of thing. And it's been a sort of striking the right balance of, capturing what we can in these tools versus like what we want to. And so that has been a bit challenging. So it's very much descriptive. I think in terms of sort of identifying where the levers are, though, that is something that we're trying to think about in terms of bringing together all of the tools. So you say you use a series of the tools in the toolbox and you have these different findings. How do you bring it all together in a way that's meaningful? It can help you to identify where you might intervene with whatever policy or program it might be. So that's definitely where, like, kind of the direction we're going in. We're not quite there yet, though, just to be honest. I don't know, Suparna, if you have anything that you want to add.
No, I will just go back to what you reiterated, that there were iterations around to what level do we actually, so are we looking at the entire farm to fork thing or the immediate food environment of the consumer? And here we have to strike a balance. So there are trade-offs using this tool, that we have to focus on a specific kind of research question where we are challenged to assess even the descriptive data. And here we are going absolutely descriptive in defining what are the food access points of the community, both from an objective observation. So this is done as a primary data collection, most importantly, and then also capturing what people think about there. So the triangulation is happening there. But we can definitely have some indicators in terms of different dimensions of the food environment, the availability, access, the affordability, and stuffs like that. So this we are brainstorming to have some kind of a diversity index or something. So only to that level we can be objective. But further, looking at the upstream drivers versus what is happening at the ground level, the purpose of this tool is matching a research question which we are trying to look for, and we don't have tools in the low middle income setup to objectively assess those descriptive indicators. So yeah, I would very much go by the research question here and try to address something in a very systematic manner. Thanks.
And I think, Belia, that your question is really important to think about in designing these descriptive tools, because we are not seeking to explain the drivers of all aspects of food choice. We are seeking to describe the food environment, and then so that researchers can use that in interesting analyses that tell us something about the farm to fork or the drivers of the food environment and drivers of food choice. So we do want to think more and more about that question of like, how can the data be used so that the data is described, the food environment is described in a way that makes it possible to answer those kinds of questions that you brought up.
Yeah, and one other thing I might just add is that we've also tried to include in the instructions manual where we think you might use complementary assessments to look at some of those drivers. So that's, like I said, one of the things that came up in the workshops were things like, where does the food come from, or some of these more upstream factors. And so then we've pointed researchers in the direction of, well, you might want to check out this other tool, or you might want to do value chain analysis alongside this if that's what's of interest for your research question. So really the focus of the toolbox is very much specifically the food environment with the, like the real sense of that definition. And then, yeah, you can use other tools to capture the things that you are interested in.
Yeah, there are a number of questions about integrating qualitative and quantitative data. And I think one of the things that has been an underlying goal for all of us is that this is a toolbox. So you use different tools for different questions that you're trying to answer. And so really thinking about what those questions are, and we have the examples of questions and you pull the tool out for what you need. And some of those are more qualitative tools. So participatory mapping, as an example, is more qualitatively driven. And so I think we've been trying to integrate different types of methods to answer different questions that you might have about the toolbox, but you have to figure out which tool to pull out based off of the questions that you're answering or interested in answering.
Yeah, and I think one thing I just might add to that is just the participatory mapping, that tool in particular is very much designed to really inform how you even use the tools in the toolbox. It really, I know Suparna already mentioned this, but it's like, it really, because some of the questions that came out in the breakout session that I was leading was around, like, say, the data collection time, like at certain times of the days, there's more vendors versus others. Even that information in terms of what time of day you might capture your data for the food environment can be informed by the participatory mapping. So that's kind of one way we're using and integrating the findings from the qualitative data with the quantitative data collection.
I can just see questions on the recall period, and we had, rounds of iterations whether to keep it for 30 days or 45 days or 6 months. But what the consensus that was reached out was 30 days, because that's the period where you see some kind of a habitual behavior and not just a one-off kind of a thing. And that's what we discussed in our breakout room also, like somebody goes to the Kinnan community, but just once in a blue moon. So do we really capture that, or it's a monthly affair? So that was the reason why we had kept the limit as 30 and a repeated. So a longitudinal data collection is very critical here to capture the seasonality part of it. And again, the participatory mapping is going to tell us a lot about the seasonal availability of, for example, fish in the river or wild foods, mushrooms, and things like that. And accordingly, we have to decide which tool to use in what time gap to capture the holistic picture of the different food environments that is accessed by the community. But 30 days was a reasonable time period that was reiterated. But over to you, Shauna, if you wish to add anything else.
No, that's great, Supana. I think that one I'll just answer. I'm seeing like some of the questions in the chat, so I know we don't have much time left, and I want to be mindful of staying on time. But there is a question about some vendors might not be open to sharing all the products they sell. How do you navigate this? This was also a question that came up in my breakout session, so I might just share a bit about that. So in general, our experience has been that they've been pretty receptive. We will get their permission at the beginning. One thing that sometimes comes up is they might not want to have the photos. For example, in the community mapping the food outlet census, you take a picture of the food outlet. And so sometimes they don't want to have a picture taken, which is totally fine. But what we have found has been helpful is, for example, having data collection badges, or having a badge that shows that you're a researcher, and explaining the reason for capturing this data to them. And then also obviously getting permission from local authorities. And we also have those permission, like the piece of paper that shows that we have those permissions with us when we're in the field. So those types of things that are very common when doing field work definitely apply to this type of work.
And I would, from my experiences, I feel like mapping of food locations is relatively unobtrusive compared to many other types of topics. And so it's oftentimes well received. So yeah. I don't know if you want to move on to the next step, Shauna, just to wrap up.
I think I will, because we have a hard stop in 3 minutes. So this is the last poll. So if you don't mind, these are the tools in the toolbox. So if you just answer the poll and let us know which tools you'd be interested in, that would be greatly appreciated. And I might just continue to talk. I know it's not great to be cognitively for me to be talking while you're filling the poll, but just in the interest of time, I will just give you some next steps in terms of the Food Environment Toolbox. So we are, as I have mentioned, finalizing the tools. We're very close to finalizing them, as well as their instructions. I was mentioning it in my breakout that it's nice to have in person to just like see. We had the tools at the workshop last week, and it's just a lot. It's a lot of paper. The instructions are very thorough, and really the idea is to help you to train enumerators with all of the instructions we've provided. So those will be available, as well as the programming files. And we will develop data analysis protocols. Like I mentioned, that's something that we're in the midst of working on. Record short videos providing an overview of each of the tools. And this is really to make it, again, easier for training of enumerators. And then we're planning to make the toolbox, all of those aspects that I just listed, available to everyone to use. So we really want this to be publicly available and for people to integrate it into their own work. That's really the idea of the toolbox. I wanted to share this QR code. So this is the current versions of the tools. Like I said, they are still a work in progress. So you can use the QR code to look at the tools, and we will make sure that we let people know once the final versions are available, though. But lastly, I just want to say thank you to all of you. We really appreciate you attending. I know for some of you, it's probably not at opportune times of the day. And so we appreciate that. Thank you for engaging. And we look forward to you using the tools. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, or if there's anything that we can help you with. And lastly, I just thank the funders, Amana, for funding this work. We are very grateful for the ability to make this toolbox. It's something that we all have really felt was needed for our own work. And so it's really great to have the opportunity to really spend a lot of focused time on this. So with that, I see it's 10 o'clock my time. So I believe that is the hard stop. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing from you and hopefully you using the tools.